Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. So I hope you brought your yoga pants, because for some folks, this week's subject might be a bit of a stretch. Look, we all have a general understanding of media as a means of mass communication, but fun fact, that's right, they're coming early in this episode. Media is the plural form of medium, as in a way that something is communicated or expressed. In that sense, the art of fashion is one of the oldest forms of media that there is. So, this week, I will put on my big boy pants and add big boy pants into our definition of media for the purposes of this podcast. That's right. This week's episode of the Band Media Podcast, we will be tackling our first piece of fashion, unit of fashion, ensemble? We'll go with ensemble. And that is the Zoot Suit, which inspired a real-life riot in the city of Los Angeles. For those of you not familiar with the Zoot Suit, imagine, if you will, an exaggerated men's suit with a long, baggy jacket with padded shoulders and high-waisted, wide-legged, tight-cuffed, pegged trousers. And of course, if you're not great at imagining, there's always Google Images, or follow my Instagram, where we will have some images of primo Zoot Suits on display for this episode. If, however, you would prefer another lingual description, I would have to go with Malcolm X, who was fond of wearing the Zoot Suit in his younger days, who described them as, quote, a killer-diller coat with a draped shape, reet pleats, and shoulders padded like a lunatic's cell, end quote. Say what you want about the man, but he certainly had a way with words. Hey everybody, this is Ronnie from the future. Well, from the past, the future of the past. It doesn't matter. Point is, I recorded this whole episode, and then my beautiful wife slash co-producer Sarah pointed out to me that I did not put in any trigger warnings. So here are this week's trigger warnings. We will be talking about violence, child abuse, and racism. And now, back to the show. Take it away, me. The Zoot Suit itself was created by Ernest Mayhand in the 1930s, though he was professionally known as Skillet from the comedy troupe Pots, Pans, and Skillet. They frequented what was known as the Chitlin Circuit, which, in a time where America was still rife with government-enforced racial segregation, was a collection of venues through the South, East, and Midwest that were safe for black performers to perform at. Over the years, the Chitlin Circuit would be graced by the likes of Count Basie, Ray Charles, Red Fox, Richard Pryor, the Jackson 5, Jimi Hendrix, the Four Tops, the Temptations, Aretha Franklin, and so many, many more. Included in that list of many, many more was the famous jazz big band leader, Cab Calloway. He was amongst those who took to the style and began to regularly wear a Zoot Suit, even going so far as to wear it in his 1943 film, Stormy Weather. Fun fact, in his dictionary, that's right, he made a dictionary, Cab Calloway's catalog, A Hepster's Dictionary from 1938, he referred to the Zoot Suit as, quote, the ultimate in clothes, the only totally and truly American civilian suit, end quote. And while it may have been Skillet that brought the Zoot Suit to the attention of jazz, it was jazz that brought the Zoot Suit to the attention of the nation. Jazz at the time was sweeping the country, and for good reason. First of all, the fact that it is one of, if not the most, truly American forms of music, born and bred in New Orleans, Louisiana. Also, America had just put the final nail in the coffin of the failed experiment that was Prohibition, a time when the speakeasies were all the rage, and jazz was the music of the speakeasy. boosting its popularity through the nation. The introduction of large-scale radio broadcasts also enabled the rapid national spread of jazz in 1932. And at the time, big bands were king. As the swing age started to flourish out of Harlem and across the land, California was going through some changes of its own. Fresh off the heels of the Great Depression, white America was looking for someone to blame for their newly found economic burdens. And the direction they looked was south. Mexicans, and this part is important, Americans of Mexican descent were blamed for the downturn, or at least for exacerbating it, particularly in the border states like Texas, Arizona, and California, where since the turn of the century, people from Mexico had been immigrating in for farming work in great numbers. It's also very much worth noting that as recently as 50 years before that, 1848 to be exact, all of the land that made up those states was still Mexican territory. So, yeah, you're going to have some Mexicans. Despite this, the federal government, working with local governments, started what is now known as the Mexican Repatriation from 1929 to 1936. What followed was the mass deportation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Reliable numbers are hard to come by, but it's estimated that anywhere between 400,000 and 2 million people were deported. A staggering estimated 60% of those deported were birthright citizens of the United States. By the 1930s, America had a Mexican population of 3 million, and Los Angeles had a higher population of ethnic Mexicans than anywhere else in the world besides Mexico. A new generation of Mexican Americans was coming up, and amongst them, a counterculture was forming. They were the Pachucos, and not to be overlooked, the Pachucas. While the movement started in El Paso, it quickly made its way to Los Angeles. The movement was deeply influenced by the booming jazz culture, the Zoot Suit becoming the official uniform of the Pachucos. The Pachuco counterculture rejected the idea of Anglo-American assimilation, a feature that Anglo-Americans were not too fond of, believing them to be un-American. Though it should be noted that Pachucos were also not so big on traditional Mexican culture either. In Mexico, Pachucos were considered to be a sort of cartoonification of Mexican Americans. As with many youth movements, their parents just didn't understand. The fact of the matter is Pachucos were amongst the first to start developing a uniquely Mexican-American heritage. Though a relatively small amount of Mexican Americans were actually Pachucos, it was widely accepted to be the precursor to the Chicano movement and become idolized in the Cholo movement after that. Now, for a quick breakdown in terminology. I know what you're thinking. Wait, history and language arts in one episode? Well, my dear friends, it's true. The only catch is this episode will cost you twice as much to listen to. That's right, math jokes too. I really should be more popular than I am. Anyways, there are 3 terms which are regularly used interchangeably, but their differences are often overlooked. That is Chicano, Hispanic, and Latino. We'll start off with Chicano because that's the most different of the 3. A Chicano, or Chicana, is a person specifically of Mexican descent who was born in the United States. Hispanic refers to people who are descendants of people from Spanish-speaking countries. So being Hispanic is more defined by a shared language than a shared geographic area. By contrast, Latino, Latina, Latinx, or my personal favorite, Latine, are people who are the descendants of people from Latin America. Now, granted, there is a large overlap between the last two. For instance, people from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, or Venezuela are both Latine and Hispanic, while people from countries like Brazil and Haiti, which are in Latin America but don't speak Spanish, would be Latine but not Hispanic. And people from Spain, where they speak Spanish but is not part of Latin America, would be Hispanic, not Latine. So an actor from Spain, like say Antonio Banderas, is very much a Hispanic actor, but not a Latine one. So now that we have that cleared up, back to the Zoot Suit. Harlem and Los Angeles weren't the only places going through some shit during the transition from the 1930s to the 1940s. Indeed, the whole world was in some shit. And that shit was World War II. America had joined the fight in December of 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And with the WW2 came the WPB, that is to say, the War Production Board. Their main job was to ensure that there was enough of scarce resources to be allocated to the war effort and to oversee the transition of peacetime industries into wartime ones. Stuff like automobile factories starting to pump out tanks and typewriter companies pushing out rifles. And to their credit, they were very good at it. In an attempt to cut back on fabric, the WPB issued regulations on suit manufacturing. These regulations created a suit that Esquire would call, quote, streamlined suits by Uncle Sam, end quote. The end result of creating that tight-fitting suit was an effective ban on the baggy, wide-cut zoot suits. Having already forgotten the lessons we learned from Prohibition about what Americans will do when you take away something they want, many were surprised to see demand for the zoot suits did not decline just because they were off the so-called legitimate market. What instead happened was a network of bootleg tailors started to pop up throughout Los Angeles and New York that were willing to make the risque garment. So, the uniform of the Pachucos stayed intact. This, however, did them and the Mexican-American population as a whole no favors with their already iffy reputation with their Anglo-American neighbors. Mexican-Americans were already facing job discrimination that left them with below poverty-level jobs, and attacks and inflammatory propaganda from the mainstream Los Angeles newspapers. Add to the fact that Los Angeles has never been a particularly well-designed city. In fact, it's objectively a fucking hellscape, as anyone who has been on any freeway in the city will tell you. But at the time, Los Angeles was going through an expansion, all of the construction and work of which would take the highest toll on the daily lives of those in Mexican-American communities. Even going so far as to add a naval school for the Naval Reserve Armory in Chavez Ravine. This would bring Navy sailors from around the country into the primarily Mexican-American area. And even despite the fact that Mexican Americans were overrepresented in the armed forces, a lot of these Navy dudes had never even seen a Mexican, either American or otherwise. This also became a point of racial tension that was ostensibly about the Zoot Suit. Then, on the morning of August 2nd, 1942, the body of Jose Gallardo Diaz was found unconscious on a road near a swimming hole that locals called Sleepy Lagoon. He was taken to the LA County General Hospital, but he sadly died shortly thereafter in what the newspapers would call the Sleepy Lagoon murder. It became a tipping point in the city. Newspapers that had already been running stories about marijuana orgies and Black Widow female gangsters. By the way, fun fact, Las Pachucas were often rumored to have switchblades hidden in their high bouffants. The newspapers jumped on this murder, which the police and papers were both now claiming was the result of Pachuco gang rivalry, and started publishing that the, quote, Mexican problem, end quote, had to be solved, and started referring to Mexican-American youth as Zoot Suiters, sometimes regardless of whether or not they were even Pachucos at all. The Los Angeles Police Department took to the streets after the Sleepy Lagoon murder and rounded up 600 youth, most of them young Latinos. The homicide investigation would end up focusing on 40 friends who were affiliated with a gang called the 38th Street Gang. Eventually, 20-year-old Henry Yavas, along with 16 of his other Zoot Suit-wearing friends, were arrested and charged with the murder. Now, in the interest of fairness, as the reporter Ben Bader put it in 2013, quote, Henry Yavas and the kids from 38th Street, Los Angeles were no angels, end quote. He would go on to say, quote, they raced cars, drank beers, and picked fights. The night that 22-year-old Jose Diaz died, Yavas probably helped start 2 brawls, including one where he reportedly hit a woman. But was it Yavez and his friends who killed Diaz in the middle of the night on August 2nd, 1942, in what would later become known as the Sleepy Lagoon murder case? Probably not. End quote. The trial that followed was such a shit show that it has gone down as one of the most egregious in history. All 17 of the young men were tried at the same time. They were not allowed to sit near or communicate with their attorney during the proceedings. None of them were allowed to change out of their infamous zoot suits for the trial. They were also made to stand up each time one was mentioned by name so the jurors could identify them, no matter how damning the statement was. The judge also permitted E. Duran Ayers, the chief of the Foreign Relation Bureau of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, to take the stand as an expert witness, where he proceeded to testify that the Mexicans as a community have a, quote, bloodlust, end quote, and, quote, biological predisposition, end quote, to crime and to killing because, and I wish I were making this up, because their Aztec ancestors practiced human sacrifice. There is one little detail I left out. The Sleepy Lagoon murder? We can't even really be sure it was an actual murder. Remember how Jose Diaz was found unconscious on the road and taken to the hospital? He never regained consciousness before he died. He never said he had been attacked. All his autopsy showed was that he had been inebriated from the night before and had a fracture at the base of his skull, which could have easily been caused by an automobile accident or even repeated falls. To this day, we still don't actually know how he died. There was only so much tension the city could take. On the night of June 3rd, 1943, 11 sailors got off a bus and started walking along Main Street. They came across a group of Pachucos in zoot suits. There was a small altercation that each side blamed the other for starting. The LAPD responded to the incident, but many of them were off-duty officers who had self-identified themselves as the Vengeance Squad. You know, like a gang. They set upon the scene looking to what one cop's personal journal would later describe as clean up Main Street from the loathsome influence of the Pachuco gangs. The next night, the sailors came back in force. Around 200 of them took a convoy of about 20 taxis and headed towards East Los Angeles, the center of the Mexican-American population of the city. They proceeded to walk down the streets with clubs. They spotted a group of young zoot suiters and proceeded to beat the shit out of them. Then they took these kids and stripped them in the street of their zoot suits and set the suits on fire, leaving them naked or near naked in the streets. They continued to march down the streets, giving the same treatment to anybody wearing a zoot suit. Coverage of the event only caused the crowds to grow. Over the next few days, thousands of sailors and white residents took to the streets, beating and stripping anyone wearing a zoot suit, barging into bars and movie theaters, demanding they turn up the house lights so they can see any zoot suits in the audience. In one incident, sailors dragged 2 zoot suiters on stage during the screening of a film, stripped them in front of the whole audience, and then urinated on their clothes. While Mexicans took the brunt of this mistreatment, it should also be noted that some Filipinos and black people were also assaulted by the rioters. The newspaper media at the time did all they could to fan the flames of violence. And if we're being honest, all they could was a shit ton. They took the side of the attackers, claiming that the riots had a, quote, cleansing effect, end quote, to rid LA of the, quote, miscreants and hoodlums, end quote. After several days of riots, over 150 people were injured and over 500 were arrested. But the real kicker is, out of all those arrested, a big fat goose egg were actual rioters. That's right. Not only were the zoot suiters and Mexican Americans beaten and left in the street, but then they were also arrested for anything from vagrancy to rioting. In the aftermath of the riots, Councilman Norris Nelson had stated, quote, "The Zoot Suit has become a badge of hoodlumism," end quote. And he tried to get the Zoot Suit outlawed within the limits of the city of Los Angeles. But all that came from that was the council encouraged the WPB to, quote, "take steps to curb illegal production of men's clothing in violation of WPB limitation orders," end quote. As far as the Sleepy Lagoon maybe murder, given the complete ineptitude of the trial, it seems only fitting that 12 of the defendants were charged with second-degree murder, and the rest were charged with lesser offenses. The 12 convicted with murder were sentenced to time at San Quentin prison. Fortunately, the decision was reversed in appeals in October of 1944 because mainly the trial didn't even have a passing resemblance to anything that you could call due process. It should be noted that the appeals court also criticized the trial judge for his bias and mishandling of the case. Now, I can hear the sound of my fellow elder millennials and even younger Gen Xers saying, "Hey, Zoot Suit Riot. Hey, Pachuco." I remember those from the whole swing revival of the mid to late 1990s. Was that era of music deeper than I remember? ? Sadly, probably not. Look, I'm not here to shit all over the swing revival. I'll even throw out that the Squirrel Nut Zippers were an amazing find of the era. But don't go looking to bands like Cherry Poppin' Daddies and Royal Carol Review for your history. Not that art has to be completely historically accurate to be valid, but those bands tended to tell a story that left out the ugly racial bias in exchange for a cartoonish cool guy persona. If you do want to experience some art about that time in our nation's history, check out the Luis Valdez film Zoot Suit, starring Edward James Olmos. As his character, El Pachuco, says in the beginning, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, the mono you are about to see is a construction of fact and fantasy. But relax, weigh the facts, and enjoy the pretense. Our Pachuco realities will only make sense if you grasp their stylization," end quote. And that, I think, is where Zoot Suit succeeds, where my beloved 90s failed. You know, it's cards on the table time again. The fact that this episode is coming out the day before Cinco de Mayo is not exactly a coincidence. While doing my research for this episode, the question kept bumping around in my head. Was this episode actually about Zoot Suits? Or was I just using a thin veneer to talk about some very unjust riots and the plight of the Mexican Americans that were targeted by them? That question is what made me think about fashion as an art form and fashion as media. What more visceral form of expression can we make than the way we choose to decorate our bodies? That's when it hit me. The only way to make sense of the harsh realities of the riots was to grasp the stylization of the people they happened to. And at the end of the day, if a Zoot Suit was worthy of putting a target that big on your back, then it's well beyond worthy of being on this humble podcast. Have a happy Cinco de Mayo, friends. And before I go, one last fun fact. I'll miss you. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach. And please like, comment, subscribe. And if you donate blood, come join our Band Media Podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.